Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to take a call on this bill, and the fact that we are supporting it. But let's face it, this is not a revolutionary, visionary, aspirational piece of legislation. This is a tinkering around the edges, tidying up, closing some loopholes. It's certainly nothing more than that. And if you look at the 5 or 6 things it proposes to do, that's in a sense all it does. I just want to pick up on a couple of things that the members from the other side have hit on this evening. Yes, I mean, obviously parents should be able to send their kids to the best schools that they possibly can, but that's about making all schools the best and not ensuring that we have super schools and then trying to police the entry into those super schools. It's about raising the standard of schools throughout New Zealand. I've got 2 very big schools in my electorate, Mount Albert Grammar and Avondale College, 2 of the biggest in New Zealand. Avondale College with 2,600 students, Mount Albert with 2,300. Certainly with Mount Albert, there is a long waiting list to get in, and they're only taking a few into their zone. Some of out of zone students into that school. The point is that the schools are good right throughout that region, and there are very few bad schools. As a result of that, while some parents choose to want to be able to put their kids into Mount Albert Grammar, they have the choice of other schools in the area which will give them first-class education. The other thing that I wanted to raise is, again, this preoccupation of national standards, and if there's one thing that will be perhaps the only thing that people will remember of this government will be is national standards. And if you look at what's happening at the moment in the United States, with what we could broadly talk about as being national standards, it was George Bush's "Leave No Child Left Behind" policy in the United States, which is effectively purports to many of the same things that we're seeing in this government's national standards. They're more or less throwing it out. It's been loudly and widely criticised and undermined by academics and practitioners alike, who are saying that this is not the way to go. This is not the way to go forward. What they're looking at now is how much progress children are making from the time they enter school to the time they finish. And this is something that was brought up by a head teacher in one of the primary schools that in my electorate, who said, the kids in my school, when they come to my school, have an English reading age of a 3-year-old. We have to obviously take those kids, but by the time they leave that primary school, they will have a reading age and a speaking age, an English reading and speaking age, which will be appropriate to their age. In other words, they have lifted those kids. They have lifted those kids 3 years. It's terrific. It's terrific. The only problem is, and I'm pleased that the other side thinks that that's good, is that for the first 2 or 3 years, that school will have seen to be failing under national standards because the kids will be below what they should be. Nothing to do with the quality of the school. The quality of the school is excellent. But because of the ridiculous way in which national standards is measured, that school will actually have been seen, certainly in the year 2, 3 and 4, to not be fulfilling what they should do. That was the concern that principal raised with me when I went and saw them. I want us to speak on 2 or 3 of the key aspects of this legislation, Mr. Speaker. One is on the secondary tertiary interface, and my colleague Grant Robinson has mentioned this as well. I think that this provides more opportunity, particularly, and as a former teacher, seeing those children who are not really coping terribly well at school, who have difficulty in terms of moving on to progressing into other tertiary education. This sort of ability has this clause enables that to happen more easily. And the Manukau Institute of Technology, which we brought in through an amendment just last year, this will amend that to make it more universal. And I think it was Colin King who mentioned Stuart Middleton, who was running that course and showing it to be a very effective way of progressing kids from secondary school into a technical institute. A former teacher, actually, of mine, Stuart Middleton, that type of role will be able to be...
He learned afterwards.
he progressed as time went on. He's gone on to much better things now after that particular experience. But I raised the same question that Mr. Mallard brought up before, which is, do we need special legislation and clauses for this? Why can't we allow this to occur within the confines of the community that's involved itself? I think that will be something that we will try and bring up in the Select Committee as we go on to take a look at that. The second thing I wanted to talk about, Mr. Speaker, in relation to this legislation is the international students. This does some useful makes some useful technical changes. It enables the Technical Institute to bring in fees that will stop the seagulling. It's a good phrase that Mr. King used of students going from one technical institute to another and effectively costing the Technical Institute a great deal of money. It also will close off a loophole of people coming into New Zealand to enrol in the Technical Institute and using that as an excuse to enter New Zealand. It will close that loophole as well. The international student industry is a huge industry to New Zealand, a $2 billion industry that's grown incredibly rapidly and is now extraordinarily important to our trade, to our relationships with other countries, particularly in Asia. Many of those students that are coming here to study will go back to wherever they came from, China, Korea, more increasingly India at the moment, and create connections that can be fostered. They'll be fostered in other ways through businesses into the future. But the real issue about this, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to mention it, is that what we're seeing now is that we are relying on overseas students to effectively subsidise the very institutions that we want to send our kids to. In fact, many of our own students find it more difficult to get into the institutions, our institutions, than our own New Zealand students are. And effectively, what we're using the international students to do is a default to fund priorities for our education system. I think it's and that's because we're not putting enough money, despite the so-called record amounts of money going into education. We're not simply putting enough money into into tertiary education. The final point I wanted to make, Mr. Speaker, is just to simply touch on the private schools and some of the legislation around the private schools. The Law Commission that was brought in under the Labor government in 2008 it looked at this and made a number of recommendations. It didn't say that we needed to wholesale change, but we definitely need to lift some of the areas around the regulations of who can run a private school and for what purpose. That legislation was first brought in 1921. It was pretty outdated. It was pretty vague in terms of both the regulations on schools and the guidance that schools might be able to use. There are 97 private schools currently in New Zealand, and this legislation, I think, Mr. Speaker, will be able to at least address some of those shortcomings as identified by the Law Commission. The great thing about these private schools, Mr. Speaker, is of course they don't have to adhere to national standards. I mean, that must be the real incentive for teachers now to go into private schools. 80% of them, they are funded 80% by the state, and that the prominence that was given to private schools was again reinforced last year when this government gave $35 million to private schools and then promptly cut the amount of money it put into adult education. I mean, you can actually see what's happening in this in the education system.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member, but his time has expired.